Okay, let's get started. Welcome to our monthly webinar series. It is a pleasure to have everybody on this Monday morning, the week before Thanksgiving. We're excited for you taking time to join us this morning. We understand the importance of you continuing your education related to your downtown programs. We also understand how hard it can be sometimes to travel. And so that's why we created these webinar series. This is probably our largest attended webinar so far, and we had a lot of people who were unable to join us this morning, but will be watching the video of this. A reminder that all of our webinars are recorded and that we convert those recordings into YouTube videos. And so if you go to YouTube and you look for Georgia Main Street, you'll see all of our past webinars. This one should be up by the end of this week as well. A couple of housekeeping comments before we get started. To assure that your computer is able to keep up with the webinar, I highly encourage you to turn off any other applications you're using, such as email, Office documents, or internet browsers. Go to webinar functions based on your connectivity and bandwidth, so the less operations you're using, the more likely the webinar will work seamlessly for you. To protect the clarity of the presentation for this session and all of our webinar sessions, everyone but the presenter will be muted during the presentation. If you have questions, you have 4 ways that you can ask those questions, but probably the easiest thing for you to use is the question feature, which you'll see on your menu. If you'll just type in your question there, it will keep a log of all the questions that are asked. And at the end of our presentation, after we finished with all of the PowerPoint part of the presentation, we'll start going through the list of questions and answering those for you. A list of all the questions and answers will be made available after the presentation. Please make sure to email us any questions that you have after the fact. If you think of something, or if someone in your community thinks of something, please feel free to do that. Like I said, once these become YouTube videos, anyone will be able to see them without registering. So if you'd like to use them to present to your elected officials, or if you'd like to use them to present to any of your boards, please feel free to do so. Today's presentation is an informational session related to downtown development authorities and main streets. Our office is constantly called and asked about the difference between those two types of organizations, the similarities, and there's a lot of questions that come up specifically with elected officials. I think over the last 3 or 4 months, I've probably conference called with 3 or 4 different cities, city councils, to discuss downtown development authorities with a relationship to their existing Main Street programs. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our approach as an agency to downtown development has been that we can provide levels of service that impact all of Georgia's communities, regardless of their populations, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of communities' ability to provide staffing levels, regardless of region and experience level in downtown development, because we believe every community can improve its central business district. And here in Georgia, we have 530 cities, and technically each city could have its own central business district. And as we travel around the state, we see examples of central business districts that have been made new, that have been renovated, rejuvenated. We've got examples of some that have been torn down over the years, and now communities are looking at ways to build that back. So we have to provide services to all of those different types of communities. And the state of Georgia has provided us with 2 very specific tools that we can use for downtown redevelopment purposes. In our programming, we offer the Our Town program, which formerly was Boomtown, and this is opportunities utilizing resources. And that's where we go into communities that talk about wanting to do downtown revitalization, but maybe don't have the capacity in place yet to go after a Main Street designation. We also offer the Startup program, which was offered this year for the first time in a couple of years. We took on startup communities, and we'll launch our program with new communities beginning in January. They've gone through an application process and have been selected, and we're working out some details with those communities as we speak. We have our Classic Main Street program, which is really the signature program for downtown development in Georgia. We have a downtown affiliate program for those communities that have capacity for downtown development but don't meet the national standards or don't want to go after the National Main Street accreditation process. And then we're very excited about the launch of our Georgia's Exceptional Main Streets program, or GEMS program. We'll be doing interviews over the next few weeks for that. We've had a lot of good applicants for that advanced level of service for Main Street communities. In Georgia, we really have two vehicles for downtown revitalization. We have downtown development authorities, and we have the Main Street program. Downtown development authorities are created through state law, and they're recognized through local government. They have a defined or restrictive membership, and they're minimally regulated. Our Main Street programs are created through public support and engagement. They're recognized through our state office, so they're recognized through state government. Generally, their membership is inclusive of multiple different groups, and they are heavily regulated by our office to make sure they meet the standards that are in place for keeping that name of Main Street. So why is downtown important? I mean, if you're in the business of downtown development, you understand it. But sometimes when we work with the general public or when we work with elected officials, we have a hard time defining the importance of a downtown. For decades before the 1960s and 70s, downtown was the town for many of our communities. And then really in the last 30 years, a lot of communities have gone on tears with annexations and pulled in more land, and you've seen the development along state highway corridors and interstates that have really taken away from the downtown area. So it's important in everything that we do to talk about why downtown matters to our communities. I want you to think about the tax base. We had an opportunity a few weeks ago to sit in on a session that was being facilitated related to density and planning. And as you'll see on your screen, this is the annual tax yield per acre in Asheville, North Carolina. And you can do similar things in your community. If you'll look at the property tax value for a residential unit versus certain commercial uses and uses that are inside the downtown area versus uses that are along state highways, if you calculate the total of taxes that are paid, property value, property taxes paid in that area, and divide that by the number of acres in that property, you'll get what's considered to be an annual tax yield per acre. And so in this example, a residential unit that's in an unincorporated part of the county is paying about $1,200 a year in property taxes per acre owned. Notice that the city residential pays a little bit more. The fourth one is the mall in Asheville, and it's paying close to $8,000 per acre in property taxes. As you start getting towards the bottom of the screen, you'll note that these are all downtown areas. And when you get into multi-story buildings in downtowns, a lot of these properties are paying a lot more in acreage for property taxes than even that mall. So the importance of a downtown area is that it's a highly concentrated number of buildings that has a significant tax benefit impact to the local community. Downtowns are town centers. They're our highest concentration of small businesses. They're generally large community employment centers. And so when you think about the downtown area, you think about the number of government offices, the number of service-based businesses, the number of retailers and restaurants, you get a high concentration of employees within the downtown area. Downtowns create our sense of place. And so when I'm in downtown Rome, I know I'm not in downtown Atlanta, and I know I'm not in downtown Savannah. I tell people all the time that if I put you on the third aisle of a major box retailer, you wouldn't know what state you're in, let alone what community you're in, because it all looks the same. Downtowns are really our sense of place, and they give us an idea of where we're at and how that community is doing from an economic standpoint. They're also our historic fabric. I told you earlier that we have 530 cities in Georgia, and so if you think of each of those communities as being a different piece to a patchwork quilt, we can see a lot of the story of our state and the people that live here, and the history of our business, and the history of agriculture, and the history of the railroad and transportation, and the history of building materials, and the history of individual people within those communities when we look at our downtowns. And that just gets to be an amazing story that we can tell others who visit our state and others outside of our state. In the 1970s in American downtowns, there was a huge demise. This had been going on for a couple of decades, and what we saw was that retailers were moving out of the downtown area and they were moving towards these malls. And our downtown property owners were starting to put less money into their facilities, and they were starting to emphasize more of their individual needs downtown rather than collectively thinking about the downtown together. So the National Trust for Historic Preservation put together a team of individuals to look at downtowns versus the commerce going on in the rest of the community and in the region. And this group of individuals quickly realized that the demise of downtown was happening through the creation of this organized business entity, which was either the shopping mall or the shopping center. And basically what they found was in these communities there was an approach that was going on that was making these business ventures much more successful than downtowns. And as business was leaving downtowns, our historic buildings were beginning to fail, and property owners were less likely to put more money into keeping them up. So the Main Street approach revolves around this four-point approach: organization, design, promotion, and economic restructuring. How is downtown organized? Is there a group of people that are looking out collectively for the interests of downtown, or is it individual property owners and individual businesses looking out for themselves? How is downtown designed? Is downtown designed for people to come into an area and walk around and feel comfortable walking around and go from store to store? Or is it created in such a way that an individual drives in, finds parking, goes into one store to make a purchase, and then leaves? How do we promote the downtown? Is downtown promoted as one specific place, such as come and shop at the shopping mall, or is it individual retailers that are going by their own approach? Are we collectively marketing downtown? Does it have its own identity and its own brand? And then finally, what's the economic restructuring look like for downtown? How do we go after economic development in historic buildings? How do we get people to sign leases on spaces that may not actually fit their traditional business plan? How do we get individuals to realize that upper floors can be used for other things? How do we get people to move downtown? How do we position downtown in such a way that it can be economically successful? And we do all four of those points under the guise of historic preservation. That is one of the backbones of the Main Street program. We want to protect the town center. We want to protect its architectural integrity. We want to protect that fabric of heritage. We want to protect the sense of place that downtown brings to our community. Just a little bit on the history of Georgia's Main Street program. We started as a state through the Main Street philosophy in 1980. We were one of the first 5 states in the country to adopt this Main Street model, along with Kentucky, North Carolina, Texas, and Pennsylvania. The Main Street program has existed at the Department of Community Affairs. It was transferred to the Department of Industry, Trade, and Tourism, which is now the Department of Economic Development. For a little bit of time it was out on its own, and now it's located in the Department of Community Affairs. Back in the mid to late 90s, the Better Hometown program was launched for smaller communities in Georgia. In 2013, we consolidated the Better Hometown program and the Main Street program for our classic Main Street program. And then we updated our startup procedures so that more communities could get involved as they're ready to get involved in our programming. So there's a distinct relationship between the Georgia Main Street program and the National Main Street program. Our state gets to design and maintain its own startup program. We get to decide how communities will enter into the Main Street mix. As those communities meet national standards, we get to designate those communities as Main Streets. Then we do a regular assessment process to make sure that those Main Streets communities are adhering to state and national standards. We also maintain specific memorandums of understanding with each of those communities that spells out what their requirements are and what we will provide to them as the state agency for being part of the program. The National Main Street program gets to set the criteria that communities must meet to hold that Main Street name. They own the Main Street trademark and the name, and so communities cannot operate as a Main Street without the approval of both the state and national program. The national program annually accredits Main Street communities based on those communities that are recommended to the national program by the state of Georgia. And so as communities are doing those annual assessments with the state, we look to make sure that a community has met all of those national standards. If it's met all the national standards, it's provided to the national program for annual accreditation. And then there's a licensing agreement between the National Main Street program and the state of Georgia, which allows Georgia to designate Main Streets that are accredited nationally. To become a Main Street, a community must apply for a startup program, and those startup applications are opened up now every 2 years. We've just finished the startup application for 2013, so 2015 will be the next round for startup communities. Those startup applicants are then selected based on their individual merits, with the understanding that they will sign a memorandum of understanding with our agency outlining that they will meet all 10 of the national standards within the first year so that they can be accredited. So we had the application process from July to the end of August. We went through the review process and the selection process. Those startup communities will start January 1. They will have to the end of December next year to meet all 10 national standards and be accredited as a Main Street community for 2015. Those startup communities must go through mandatory training, so there's a year worth of mandatory training. They have to have a staff and a budget to support the program. They have to have a board of directors in place. They must complete monthly reports and pass that annual assessment, letting us know that they meet those 10 national standards within that first year. For those communities that are already a Main Street program or have come into the Main Street program via the old Better Hometown program, they must maintain a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Community Affairs. They have to have paid staff, and when we say paid staff, we look at that based on the individual community. Under the old program, Better Hometowns were allowed to have a part-time staff person. Main Street programs were required to have a full-time staff person. The way we look at communities now is based on the community and how the organization is set up. In our larger communities, we expect to have at least one person that is just working on the downtown area. But we also understand that in many communities, the Office of Downtown Development within that community, based on population size, may also hold a number of other functions. And so it may be a collective group of individuals that are serving that full-time role based on their individual parts of that organization. Likewise, we have some communities that hover around that 5,000 in population mark, and we wouldn't require them to have a full-time staff person if they have either multiple people working on the job or they have a very active board of directors supporting a part-time person and are able to meet those annual requirements. In our smaller communities, we do require that there be at least a part-time person, But we also understand that in those communities, if it's a community's will to see downtown succeed, they may go above and beyond and have a full-time person on board. We expect all of those existing Main Street programs to meet the 10 national standards, and part of those national standards require that communities do monthly reports to our office on economic activity. Communities are also asked to go through an annual assessment process. This year we had two different varieties of annual assessments. We had a full annual assessment that was done through written documentation by communities that had not done an annual assessment for the past year. And then we had online mini assessments for communities that had done a full assessment within the past year for them to update us on their information. So how did the local Main Streets function? Local Main Streets function under a local board of directors, and that board of directors can vary. We will talk about that in a minute. They have a paid manager, whether part-time or full-time. They operate under local bylaws. They do a local annual work plan, which identifies what their goals are and their objectives for making downtown succeed over the next year. They generally have working committees that are pushing that work plan to fruition, and they operate from diverse funding sources. Local Main Street governance can vary by community. The local board can be made up of a collection of different ways. There's a distinct model in the state of Georgia that's also followed by just a couple other states where we have allowed our Main Street programs to be set up through local governments, through cities, and operate as the Downtown Development Authority or an Urban Redevelopment Authority. So in those cases, the DDA or URA board also serves as the board of the Main Street program. That model does not exist in other states. Some states require that the Main Street program be completely separate from local government, but in Georgia we allow it. We also have a hybrid example where we have a board of directors where a number of the board members serve both on the Downtown Development Authority and the Main Street Board, and then other individuals are invited to sit on the Main Street Board, which makes it a separate organization. We have examples where the Main Street program has been created as a local nonprofit, either a 501c3, C4, or C6 organization. And that organization is built off of its local bylaws, which create its membership or create its tax-exempt status. And then finally, we have examples of communities where the Main Street Board is an advisory group that is set up and represents a number of entities. So for instance, it may be a group of 6 board members with board members that represent the Downtown Development Authority, Historic Preservation, Tourism, Merchants Association, the city staff, etc. The regulations on these types of groups will vary by the type it's set up as. If it's set up as a Downtown Development Authority, it'll have a different regulatory requirement than if it's set up as a 501c6 organization. The funding also varies by the type mentioned above. So organizations may or may not be able to accept certain funding depending on how they're set up. All of those organizations have to have a contract with the Department of Community Affairs, and we do that through the Memorandum of Understanding process on an annual basis. That MOU spells out what city we're working with, what's the organization sponsoring the program in that community, and what's their role with Main Street and the Department of Community Affairs. And then we expect board training, no matter the group, through the annual assessment process. We don't mandate that every board member go through so many hours of training per year, but as we're doing the annual assessment, we're looking for examples of how your board has had an opportunity to go through training and has attended training throughout the state throughout the year. Downtown Development Authorities. There are really 3 types of authorities that exist in the state of Georgia. We have constitutional downtown development authorities. There's 21 of those on the books, although several of those have effectively been closed. These constitutional development authorities were created in one of two ways. They were either created through a local constitutional amendment that had enabling legislation, or a constitutional amendment that did not have enabling legislation. In any case, the voters of those communities voted to allow a development authority, a downtown development authority, be created to assist in the revitalization of the central business district prior to 1981. Then we have some examples of pre-1981 statutory development authorities, where development authorities were created through the auspices of the General Assembly and various tools that existed in state code. And the majority of our downtown development authorities in Georgia were created in 1981 or closer to the present under the generic Downtown Development Authority statute. And those development authorities all operate under that single state statute. We do not allow for the creation of constitutional development authorities or any of those statutory development authorities that do not fall under the 1981 statute at this time. So depending on which type of authority you have in your community, membership for serving on that board, how you can raise funds, and the specific duties of your authority may vary. For the purpose of this presentation moving forward, we'll be talking about specifically that 1981 statute and how that impacts communities. So the big thing to understand with the 1981 statute is that the state of Georgia allows all 530 cities to create a downtown development authority. So there's an inherent right within cities to have their own downtown development authority. To do that, the City Council has to approve a resolution at a council meeting stating the need for a downtown development authority. That resolution should also include the makeup of the board. State law requires that there be 7 voting members to the board. It does not allow for there to be 6 voting members. It does not allow for there to be 8 voting members. It maintains that for a new downtown development authority or a downtown development authority created after 1981, that there be 7 voting members. Now, speaking to that, it does not restrict a community from having ex officios sit on the board. It does not restrict a community from having a city council liaison placed on the board, which may be a council member that reports from the board back to the city on a regular basis. It just says that there can only be 7 voting members for the action of the board. Of those voting members, 4 must have a business interest within the district. Now, the definition of business interest can be a little bit of gray area in the state law, but traditionally the way we've looked at it is we've looked for an individual who either owns a business in the downtown or has a controlling interest in a downtown business, or an individual who owns commercial property within the downtown area. Now, that business interest can also go towards the management side. So if you, for instance, had a restaurant in the downtown area and say the owner of the restaurant did not want to sit on the board, a manager of a restaurant could sit on the board because it's deemed that that business has an interest in the downtown district. A downtown development authority may have 1 member of the board that is a city council member or the mayor. That city council member or the mayor's term on the downtown development authority coincides with their term on the city council. But you can only have 1. You may not have more than 1. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about ex officios and liaisons, what a lot of communities will do is not take up one of the voting member seats by using that council member or mayor provision, but provide a liaison to that group that doesn't necessarily vote, but sits near the board to make sure that they're all working on the same page with the city. You may have 1 board member that has a business interest within the downtown area that lives outside of the county, and that is a new change to state law that took place a few years ago. Now, of your 4 that have a business interest within the city, they do not have to live within the city. They may live outside of the city, inside the county. One of those members may live outside of the county. And then, of course, those that do not fit the 3 criteria above need to be city residents. So up to 3 of the members may just be city residents that don't have a business interest within the district. These board members are appointed by the city council, and that's something very important for communities to understand. It is not a legal capacity for downtown development authority boards to appoint their own members. Now, they can make recommendations for membership, but members are appointed under the law by the city council. In some communities, their appointment policies differ. For boards, it may give the approval to the mayor to nominate individuals to sit on the city council, and the city council to approve those nominations. It may allow each member of the council to appoint someone to the DDA board, or it may allow the DDA board to make recommendations to the council for those appointments. Regardless of the process, those appointments have to be approved by the city council. And the terms for board members are 4 years. There is provision in the law on how terms are set to be staggered with brand new development authorities, but the term of a board member is to be 4 years. Board members are required to go through 8 hours of training within the first year that they're appointed to the Downtown Development Authority. Little caveat I'll mention about training is state law doesn't specify what that training is or who is to do that training. Now, there is training offered throughout the year through the Georgia Municipal Association and Carl Vinson Institute. One could say that if you attend a downtown conference or Main Street University, or if your community has hired a consultant to come in and educate the downtown area on programs of downtown development, that if you've undergone 8 hours of that training, you have met that criteria. Because the state law, as I said, is vague on that. Something new that communities have to do now related to training over the last couple of years is specify which board members have undergone training as part of their annual report to our agency. And I'll go over that in a few minutes. The financing capability of downtown development authorities is one of the things that makes it a lucrative tool for downtown development. DDAs are allowed to issue revenue bonds. They're not allowed to do general obligation bonds, but to do revenue bonds. And revenue bonds are bonds that are sold on the market where a revenue stream has been identified to pay the bond, to repay the bond. These bonds are generally tax-exempt bonds. And so, for instance, if a downtown development authority wanted to undertake a downtown project and they had a revenue stream to back that, whether it be their own budget, rents from properties that they own, tax funds that are pledged to the organization, they could go out and issue a bond and back that bond through those revenue streams. A general obligation bond would be if a downtown development authority went out and issued a bond tying tax revenues that it can levy on its own. And the 1981 statute does not provide for a tax revenue that is levied specifically by a downtown development authority. And so that's where general obligation bonds do not work with DDAs, 1981 forward. Now, some of those downtown development authorities created through constitutional amendments may have the ability to do general obligation bonds based on their taxing powers. A downtown development authority can do an intergovernmental agreement or IGA-backed loan, and that IGA can prove a revenue stream. So, for instance, in a community where a downtown development authority is receiving a portion of hotel taxes, rental car taxes, or just funds through a general appropriation of the city council, through the city, that revenue stream can be shown through an intergovernmental agreement between the city and that downtown development authority that can be used to back a loan that is taken by the downtown development authority. DDAs can receive dedicated tax revenues from the rental car tax, non-restricted hotel-motel taxes, and in some cases restricted taxes depending on how they're set up, and also funds from special tax districts such as business improvement districts, community improvement districts, tax allocation districts, or generic special tax districts. A downtown development authority may also undertake for-profit activities. State law allows a downtown development authority to do anything that a public sector or private sector corporation or business entity can do, as long as it's not in conflict with the general statute that created downtown development authorities in Georgia. There's some contractual rights that downtown development authorities have. A downtown development authority can enter into a contract with another governmental group through what we call those intergovernmental agreements, or IGAs, for up to 50 years. So there can be a 50-year contract between a DDA and a city, or a 50-year contract between a DDA and a county, a 50-year contract between the downtown development authority and another type of development authority. And you could also have a 50-year contract between the downtown development authority and a state agency. One of the things that's very significant about that is that city governments cannot contract with the private sector past the longest remaining term of a council member. So if you had a council member that was just elected in November and their term starts in January and it's a 4-year term, the longest contract that a city government could undertake would be a 4-year contract with the private sector. Downtown development authorities can contract with the private sector for up to 50 years. And so that's a distinct difference between a downtown development authority and a city council. So a city, for instance, that wants to do business with the private sector and is limited in that business by that 4-year contract can enter into an intergovernmental agreement with a downtown development authority to do business with that private sector group for up to 50 years. And that relationship between the city and the downtown development authority can be 50 years, and then in retrospect to that, a 50-year agreement between the downtown development authority and the private sector. Liability protection, state loans and grants. Traditionally, not in all cases, but traditionally, downtown development authorities can be covered under the city's liability policy, specifically when those boards are working through their capacity as board members. So, for instance, in a lot of communities, if the downtown development authority is out doing a project and someone attempts to sue the downtown development authority, it's covered under the city's liability policy because that board is appointed by the city. Now, this is not always the case, so it's very important if you have a downtown development authority that you sit down with the city attorney, city manager, the city's risk manager to find out what the coverage extents are for your downtown development authority board members in its organization as it relates to the city. In some cases, DDAs are not covered under the city's liability policy, and that's something that you should consider when you're working through your boards. Downtown development authorities are eligible to apply for and receive state loans and grants. The state of Georgia may do loans and grants to government agencies. So if we're doing a project in a local community, we may make a loan or a grant to the city, to a county, or to a downtown development authority. We cannot make a grant or a loan specific to a private business. And so we often use downtown development authorities as conduit to get those projects done. Likewise, we cannot do a loan or a grant to a Main Street program because a Main Street program does not exist in the state statute. There are some responsibilities and reporting requirements for downtown development authorities. Downtown development authorities must be audited annually, as all government bodies in Georgia are to do. They must complete an annual report of local government authority finances with our agency. So there's a report that can be done online, but it has to be done on an annual basis. communities that are not in compliance with that with their downtown development authority may find it impossible to do bond financing without having that report in place. They're also annually required to register with our office as a local government authority. I'll show you that in a minute as well. Downtown development authorities are not required to have staff by state law. They are required to observe both the Open Meetings and Open Records Acts of the state. So any business they undertake must be done in public. Of course, they have the same rights for executive sessions, closed sessions as it relates to real estate, personnel, etc. But they are required to have open meetings that are accessible to the public and to provide records of those meetings accessible to the public. There is a public meeting anytime a quorum is present, and a quorum being a majority of voting board members, and they have to give notice of those meetings and provide copies of the minutes for those meetings on a timely basis. Typically, a downtown development authority's fiscal year will follow the municipality, though that may not always be the case. So I'm going to give you an example of a project where a downtown development authority was used. And this project's very close to me because this is from Woodstock, Georgia, where I worked prior to coming to the state. The city owned this train depot in the middle of downtown, though the railroad owned the land that the train depot sat on top of. And at the time, the city was utilizing the train depot as a special event / community center venue that was pretty underutilized. The railroad was only charging a nominal lease per year. I can't remember if it was $1 or $100 a year for the land, but it was pretty nominal. There was a developer that was interested in doing a major project that was on the side and behind this train depot, but they also wanted the train depot to be part of the project and put in a restaurant. They went in and did some cost allocations and noted that it would take about $300,000 to repair the building. Part of the issue with this project was that since the city owned the building and the developer wanted to do a project, the city could only turn around and lease the building to the developer for up to 4 years. And at 4 years, the developer did not feel that they would be able to recapture the funds that they were putting into the building. So there were some contract issues that arose. Additionally, the railroad, when it found out that the property was going to be used not for a public use but for a private use, wanted to increase its lease to the city. So the Downtown Development Authority was used in this case as a solution. The city quitclaim deeded the building to the Downtown Development Authority, so now the Downtown Development Authority owns the building. Remember that Downtown Development Authorities are allowed to do leases and contracts with the public or private sector for over 4 years and up to 50 years. So the Downtown Development Authority entered into a new land lease with the railroad, which was a profit-sharing land lease. So based on the lease of the property and how that lease escalated over a number of years, the railroad would receive more money on an annual basis as part of its lease, its land lease. The Downtown Development Authority then turned around and leased the building out to a developer. The developer's lease also showed that it had to pay the land lease to the railroad, so the DDA was not technically out of any money for that land lease, and allowed the developer to then sublease the building to a restaurant. So in this case, there's shared revenues. The restaurant is making money by opening up in the space. It is paying its lease to the developer. The developer, in turn, is then paying off the costs it put into the property and its note in the property with the bank. And it's also paying the land lease to the railroad. The railroad is making money off the land lease now that the property is in private use. The city is making money off the project by getting new license fees and also by getting taxes off the sale of foods and spirits within the property. The Downtown Development Authority can make lease revenues based off of its lease to the developer, although in this case it opted not to make any money on the deal, but to make sure that everyone was profitable to keep the property going in the right direction. So this is an example where a Downtown Development Authority was used as a solution to a problem that the city could not do on its own. Downtown development authorities were created to stand in the gap between the public sector, city government, and the private sector, businesses, to make hard deals, hard development projects happen. So how can a Main Street and a DDA coexist? Well, they can exist through same or similar boards. I told you earlier that a DDA board can be a Main Street board, or maybe that board should have an overlap of members. They have to clearly understand what their roles are related to downtown development. And that may be that the DDA is truly just a financing mechanism or a contractual mechanism to do projects, and that the Main Street program is really handling more of the recruitment of business or the marketing of the community as a whole. They have to have a clear understanding of what downtown staff exists. So in existence where you have a Main Street program that has paid staff and a downtown development authority that doesn't have paid staff, does the DDA report or does the DDA fall under that Main Street staff member? Those are questions that the city government, the Main Street program, the Downtown Development Authority need to understand. And then they need to make sure that they're playing off their own unique strengths. So if there's need for the public sector to get involved in a project downtown, you may not want to use the Main Street program. You may want to utilize the Downtown Development Authority because that group's unique strength is to make projects possible. So some best practices from around the state: have an overlap on your boards if it's not the same board. Have an overlap in staff so that all the staff people involved understand what's working together. You may have a budget overlap. When we look at downtown budgets, we traditionally want to look at what's going on with the Downtown Development Authority, what's going on with the Main Street program, because that really is the overall downtown development budget. You may want to consider an intergovernmental agreement between the groups. Where the boards are not the same, you may want to look at your Downtown Development Authority serving as your Economic Restructuring Committee for the Main Street program, so that it's specifically going out to recruit businesses in and being utilized as a tool to help develop those projects. I would always suggest, if there are two separate boards, that you have an annual joint meeting between the two so that you can go over work plans and make sure that there's not some conflict between what everybody is doing. And then finally, you should have monthly updates between the two groups so that everybody knows what's going on across the board. We're going to start going through the questions. Before we do that, I do want to show you one tool on our DCA website. Let me pull that up right quick. If you go to the Department of Community Affairs main webpage, which is dca.ga.gov, across the top you will see some tabs. One of those tabs is Searchable Databases. So if you click Searchable Databases, one of the choices that you'll see come up is Registered Authorities Database. So if you will click on Registered Authorities Database, this will allow you to look and see what type of Downtown Development Authority exists, if any is registered as existing in your community. Note that this is 2013 Directory of Registered Authorities. So authorities that have not registered with our agency will not show up in these lists. So we're going to go right here to the city of Athens, Clarke County, consolidated government. Everybody's listed in here alphabetically by city, county, town. So we're going to click on Athens, Clarke County and hit search. This is going to pull up a list of all of the local governmental authorities that exist in Athens, Clarke County. I want you to note that it tells you the authority name. This type of authority is based on our codes to tell us exactly where it fits within our type of authority registrants here in Georgia. It'll tell you the method that it was created, whether it was statutory or constitutional, and if it represents multiple jurisdictions. So for instance, in Athens, we see they have an Athens Clarke County Downtown Development Authority that's general statute. This organization was created post-1981. They also have the Downtown Athens Development Authority that was created by local constitutional amendment. So this was created prior to 1981. So they in fact have two DDAs within Athens. If you click on either one of these, what will pull you up is the registered information for that organization. The year it was created, how it was created, where its citation is in state government. So in this one you would find it's in a constitutional amendment from 1977. What communities represent the organization that's shown here as members. In this case, it gives you the primary contact for that community. So Catherine Lukowski, who was the former executive director of the Downtown Development Authority, would have filed this in late 2012 when she was still working there. So she's the current contact, although you can always contact our office to change contacts. And then it lists the board members for that organization. And depending on, again, what type of organization you have, the number of board members will vary. So if you have questions as to what type of authority you have in your local government, be sure to go to the DCA webpage and go under Searchable Databases and then look under Local Government Registered Authorities. Look under Registered Authorities Database. So now that we've gone through that, I'm going to open it up here for a second to questions that we might have. And help me out, I'm going to pull this up and start going through any questions. Does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask? One question that we traditionally get is, what are the training schedule for GMA and the Carl Vinson Institute for the upcoming year? And so I am going to ask Jessica, I think she's pulled that up for us, to comment on that. Hold on just a second. I don't think the sound is coming in on Jessica right this second. So give us a second on that. I did have one question come in. That question is a DDA member limited to one 4-year term? And the answer to that question is the state law does not limit a DDA member to one 4-year term. Now, there could be a local policy that's created by the city that would limit the number of terms that a board member may serve, but the state of Georgia says that it's just a 4-year term. So that would be up to the local community to enhance that state law, so to speak. The DDA Main Street board members often have to chair their own subcommittees for specific functions, such as decorations committees or budget committees. And the answer to that is no. A Downtown Development Authority board may decide to set up committees, and its committees may not even have board members on it. The same thing with the Main Street program. You may have committees that are run by volunteers. Now, traditionally what we've seen is that a board member has served as the chair or an important leadership role within that committee, but they can create ad hoc committees to do the work of those organizations without specifically having participate on that subcommittee. Our community does not have a Downtown Development Authority. We have a Main Street Association and Board of Directors. Can we get projects done through your Downtown Revolving Loan Fund program? The answer to that is yes. we can make loans through the DDRLF to the city. We cannot make that loan to the Main Street organization or its board of directors. The loan has to either flow through the city or a downtown development authority. So if you don't have a downtown development authority, we have to flow that funding through the city, which has to be approved by the city council. If you were a startup community, would you recommend having both a Main Street board and a downtown development authority? That's an interesting question, and I think a lot of it has to do with the individual community. There are some great benefits to having them be the same board of directors. From a staffing perspective, it's a lot easier to work with a board that's only one group of people and you only have to do the presentation one time. But even if it is the same board, you need to make sure that all their meetings are following the Open Records and Open Meetings Act. For communities where you have a lot of business members, a lot of business community that does not live within the city, sometimes it can be difficult in having a downtown development authority board, especially if the DDA district is very small, that is easily filled with board members. Sometimes it's a lot easier for Main Street boards to recruit members because they don't have to follow the statutes of the state law. So, it really just depends on how the organization is set up, what type of area you're pulling from, and what the demographics are for your local business community. The DDA and the Main Street can be functions where individual property owners or business owners within a downtown area that aren't able to vote in city elections can have an impact on local policy because they don't have to reside within that area to be a participant in the process. We were once told you have to have a DDA to qualify for this pool of funding in your downtown. Our loan fund program flows through either a downtown development authority or a city government. Now, depending on the project and whether or not a city wanted to participate in the project, a downtown development authority may be required to do that. So if you have a question about the revolving loan fund, you need to call Kim Carter, who handles our revolving loan fund program, and her number is 404-679-0604. Could the DDA be comprised of 4 business owners and 3 interested residents? A downtown development authority law requires that 4 of the board members have a business interest downtown, so 4 business owners would meet that, and 3 interested residents. That would meet it as long as those residents were residents of the city. The 4 business owners, only one of them can live outside of the county. So if of those 4 business owners, more than one lived outside of the county, then that would be a no. But remember, those boards are appointed by the city council. So ultimately, the city council gets the decision as to what the makeup of that board is. So it may decide that it's 3 business owners and 1 commercial property owner, or it could be all 4 business owners, or technically it could be 4 commercial property owners and no business owners. So it really falls to that city council. We have 1 DDA Main Street board, but 2 separate budgets. Main Street budget is decided by the council, but there are separate funds that the DDA manages. Which budget should we review at our DDA board meetings? I would suggest that you review both. If it's the same board, I would look at both the budgets. Because you're asking the board to work on downtown programming and you've got multiple groups. So I would look at both budgets as part of that. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email them to me or to Jessica, or you can simply email them to mainstreet@dca.ga.gov. We'll be happy to get that information out to you. We will be sending a copy of this recording through our YouTube process, so it will be on our Georgia Main Street Program YouTube channel. Jessica, are you with us now?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, we can. What are those 4 trainings that are done by GMA and Carl Vinson?
Sure. They've got a couple different ones. They have some for just the basic training, and then they're actually doing a couple for advanced training. So the basic ones start in February. The first one will be Friday, February 28th in Athens. I know that they've talked about maybe rescheduling that for Douglasville, but that's still up in the air right now. So we're just going to be on the safe side, say that one's going to be in Athens. The next one will be Friday, March 14th, and that will be held in Tifton. Then Saturday, June 21st, that'll be held in Savannah, and that's always in conjunction with their annual GMA convention. And then the last one for the year will be Tuesday, August 19th in Decatur, and that will be the day before the Georgia Downtown Conference. And for the advanced training courses, their first one will be Saturday, January 25th as part of Mayor's Day. And then the next one will be held Tuesday, August 19th in Decatur. That will also be right before the Georgia Downtown Conference. And I can make sure that we send these out along with the link to the webinar for those who want to view the recorded version and then also see this flyer, for them to share with their boards. And I'll also tell you guys that our office is currently working to see how we can take some of this DDA training and break it down to more manageable bite-sized portions and even do it in a webinar version so that those board members that it's hard to get them to leave and hard to get them access to training will still be able to do training but be able to do it from their own desk at their home or at work. So that's what we're working on.
All right. Well, thank everyone for coming today, and we hope this has been beneficial to you. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email those to mainstreet@dca.ga.gov, and we will see you next month for our next webinar. Have a great day.